Wizards of the Coast was in the kind of position young companies can only dream of, having a product so hot that they can't keep it on the shelves. Other companies were quickly leaping up, trying to hop onto the bandwagon with their own card games. But Magic had a solid lead with experienced testing and refinement, as well as an established relationship with a printer. It had been the fairy tale story come to life of the little company of dreamers striking it rich. But life isn't always like a story where the last page is the ending. The future of the company and the game was still being determined. To find out what happened, let's travel back to the second era of Magic's history, the Age of Expansion. There was just one area of concern here, that the game was being played in a way that fundamentally differed with how it was designed. It was operating at a power level that had been within the theoretical possibility, sure, but beyond what was considered to be likely. In an article about clear imbalance in the card game's rush to market to cash in on the collectible card game craze, Richard Garfield was able to see the plank in his own eye, as it were. There are many cards in Magic that I consider to be mistakes. These cards were usually not a result of ignorance about the power of the cards. After 2 years of playtesting, the potential effects of the cards were pretty well understood. Rather, the mistakes stemmed from a misunderstanding about the way Magic would ultimately be played. The result of this would be the third edition of the Magic base set being adjusted to reduce the power level. Gone would be the Power 9, along with 26 other cards removed for reasons of either power or overcomplexity. Among them was a fairly unique card whose reputation was only enhanced by its iconic art, Chaos Orb. Unlike any of the other cards in Alpha, the card only described what you did with it. The actual power of the card depended upon you. You tossed it, and it destroyed what it landed on. This would lead to a Magic urban legend about a tournament player who won the game by taking his Chaos Orb, tearing it into pieces, and scattering it over his opponent's entire field of cards. According to some accounts of the legend, he was then disqualified by a judge, but not for the act, but because he now had too few cards in his deck to meet the legal requirements. Other cards removed included Time Vault, a source of more problems because of its ability to give unlimited turns with the right manipulation. Sinkhole and Ice Storm, black and green land destroying spells. Berserk, which doubled a creature's power. And Icy Manipulator, which could tap or untap cards. Icy Manipulator wasn't chosen strictly for its power, though, but because it created confusion. The same reason that Lich, Twiddle, Jade Statue, and Illusionary Mask were removed. In their place, 39 cards were chosen from Arabian Nights and Antiquities for it. Typically not the most powerful cards like Mishra's Factory or Library of Alexandria. They were attempting to go for something more balanced. This set would be called Revised, and it would be just as significant for something that it didn't remove. As mentioned, Arabian Nights was the first time that lands did something besides tap for mana. But you might recall me mentioning Volcanic Island, when the 5 lands for the game are Plains, Island, Swamp, Mountain, and Forest. So what's a Volcanic Island do? Well, it's an island with a big flaming mountain on it. Thus it's a card that was both an island and a mountain at the same time. This not only meant you could get either blue or red mana depending on what you wanted, but also that for all purposes, it was both an island and a mountain, and the fact could often come in handy. There were 9 others too, for each combination of 2 basic lands. A tropical island is obviously an island with a forest on it. A plateau is a mountain and a plains. A savanna is a forest and a plains, and so on. Because there are so many advantages and so few disadvantages to use one of these lands, they were generally considered to be superior to the 5 basic lands, as they're called. This reprint is important because it ensured there would be much more available of these important cards. Every copy of them in every printing is valuable. These original dual lands are perhaps the only cards first appearing in the limited edition that have their value strictly determined by the number that are available and their power level. In other words, the only cards which might see a drop in price for some versions if Wizards of the Coast were to ever print more of them. This will be an important point when we get to part 3. One thing I should mention is that I'm going to be writing this series knowing that many of you, if you're watching this, probably know something about how the game is played. But I don't want to assume that everybody out there does, so please indulge me as from time to time I fill in the blanks for the sake of those who are more interested in the lore than in the game itself. First, one of the central concepts of Magic is that using something requires you to tap it. That is, turn the card sideways to indicate it's already done something. You've tapped a land to get mana out of it, or a mock sapphire to get a blue mana out of it. Now, in the early days, one of the things you could do when it was your turn was to declare an attack. The structure of the turn and terminology on this has changed radically over the years. Today, this is a mandatory step and the central part of your turn. You don't have to attack, but the combat phase still happens. In the beginning, there was no such thing. The word combat isn't in the rules text of a single card in Limited, and appears only once in the rulebook. In fact, the card Jade's Statue is the card that offers the term for it, calling it the Attack Exchange. In the early days of Magic, there was a great deal of intuitiveness about what cards did and how rules of timing worked. This allowed the simple concept of regeneration to work. Your creature's about to die, so you regenerate it instead so that it can't. Once they started hammering out the rules, regeneration turned into such a ridiculous timing situation that they finally just abandoned it completely back in 2016. Revise also started streamlining the cards by using symbols instead of literally spelling everything out. For instance, there would be a red mana symbol used instead of saying red mana. A symbol was created for tapping a card, a letter T that was twisted 45 degrees. Both of these allowed them to simplify the artifacts that weren't also creatures. Originally, those non-creature artifacts were divided into mono artifacts, poly artifacts, and continuous artifacts. But now you just treated the text on them the same way that you did on a creature. Some cards were meant to do something and not let regeneration get in the way. Most famously, Wrath of God, a card that killed all of the creatures and was to leave no survivors. Plus, sometimes you needed to sacrifice a creature, and players would want to try to regenerate them when they were supposed to be making a sacrifice. This led them to add a new term in Revised called bury, meaning put this in the graveyard no matter what. It's an example of how they were trying to standardize things a bit more so that players could more easily grasp what was happening. This dependence on intuitiveness would crop up with what would follow, and once again, it wouldn't be Ice Age, much to the surprise of Scaphilius. Garfield had intended Magic the Gathering to last for 1 year, to be replaced a year later by Magic Ice Age. The early portion of the game was even referred to publicly as the Gathering series. Instead, they were going to put Ice Age on hold still longer, which was why Elias found himself suddenly drawn into a surprise project by the so-called Canadian Playtest Group. Remember that Wizards of the Coast's founding had been intended to be RPGs. The card game was a pie-in-the-sky hope that turned into the company's breakout success. One of the ones to begin with Peter Adkison was Steve Conrad, but early on he married and moved to Vancouver, where he met Robin Herbert. Being in a new country, he was pleased to find someone else who loved Dungeons & Dragons, and eventually Herbert tagged along with Conrad for a trip to Seattle to see how the company was doing, which was when they first got to see Magic in action. The pair were hooked and knew this was a game that had a future. And since Adkison knew Conrad knew a thing or two about game design, told him that he wanted him and his friend to think about this, see what ideas they could come up with. So they started cooking up card ideas, trying them out, seeing what interesting concepts they could develop. The Christmas before Magic's release, Atkinson made arrangements to bring some of his friends to the lodge that Boeing used for a 3-day weekend. Much of the time, Atkinson and Conrad were there talking about the cards being developed by the Canadian group, discussing the direction to take things, formulating the core for the set that Elias was about to help them out with. But before we get back to poor Elias, we'll jump ahead a little bit into the future, because this wasn't the only lodge trip in Wizards' early days. When Wizards of the Coast returned to Gen Con in 1994, it was in triumph, the company having since the year before moved out of Peter Atkinson's basement and into an office with 50 employees, and with a hiring approach of, "We need warm bodies." As one person who was there later noted, if you were a Seattle gamer fired by Wizards of the Coast that first year, you had to be guilty of willful incompetence. This flood of now prosperous 20-somethings soon began engaging in, well, to call it amorous after-work activities would be to spruce up what was basically just an excuse to have lots of sex with each other. After another impressive year at Gen Con, Atkinson wanted to give his team that had worked so damn hard to make his dream into the skyrocketing company that it was, a bit of time to enjoy the fruits of their victory. So he took them by chartered bus to a rented ski lodge, where they were really able to cut loose on their sexual antics. And even those who weren't actively engaged decided to play a drinking game and revealing sexual secrets, at which a drunken Atkinson was willing to share his own most intimate details. This proved to be a mistake. Atkinson had always seen everyone at Wizards of the Coast as his friends, and he wanted the company to be as flat, hierarchically, as possible. In his mind, when they were playing that drinking game, they were all equals. But whatever went through his mind, the reality of it was that Atkinson was the boss of everyone in that room. He had more power than anyone in that room. He was awakened the following morning by Lisa Stevens, the VP whose connection had allowed them to get a printer for Magic in the first place, and told him just how much he'd screwed up. An early hours conversation with their lawyers confirmed this for her. Whatever his intentions, whatever his personal views about how he wanted his company to be, it was a company with shareholders, and he had just exposed them all to potential lawsuits for his behavior. He needed to make a decision. Was he running a company, or was he just some idiot who stumbled into success and was going to stumble his way out of it again? Atkinson had made Wizards of the Coast because he wanted to have his dream job of making games. But it really hit him that for all his insistence that he might just be this Seattle guy who was anti-corporate, don't trust the lawyers or the bankers, I'm going to disrupt the system kind of player, nevertheless, dozens of people's livelihoods were in his hands now. The life savings of a janitor at Boeing, all his investors, not to mention all the fans around the world that had fallen in love with Magic the Gathering. Peter Atkinson was the head of a company, and he accepted that he needed to act like it. Almost immediately, he began taking MBA courses. He started educating himself in what all these experts he brought in were trying to tell him. As some kind of Silicon Valley .com millionaire, Atkinson had found himself in the position of rising to a level of success that was beyond his ability. But he had been slapped in the face hard enough to realize the need to gain the skills to steer Wizards of the Coast through these difficult first 2 years. Or else, Magic would implode, and with it, all of his dreams. It's important not to downplay this. While Richard Garfield's literal genius made the game, Atkinson's connections, leadership, and personal commitment to see it made into a reality are what turned it from a game being played among grad students into a global phenomenon. His instincts were what had convinced him to call up Elias, yes, we're finally back to him, to talk about the Canadian playtest group. He had a sense of what the gamers wanted and knew it was just too early to give them Magic Ice Age, for reasons that we're going to get into next time. So Atkinson asked Conrad to come down and show him and Stevens what they developed for their set, originally to be called The Legend Continues, but shortened to Legends. They both liked it and agreed this was what needed to come next, which is when our story finally catches up with poor Elias. As you might have gleaned, while Garfield and Atkinson were the two dynamic front members of the band, Scaff Elias and Lisa Stevens were their respective backups, the essential two that ensured, while the others held the spotlight, that this enterprise endured. Elias was there to ensure Garfield didn't get too interested in the theoretical possibilities that he missed out on the practical opportunities. Stevens was seizing opportunities and spotting benefits that Atkinson's inexperience in business would have missed. Garfield and Atkinson could focus on the big problems because they had two gifted people handling the details and heading off problems before they became crises. Elias could always be counted on to do what was best for the game first, so he put aside all the work on Ice Age, again, to take a look at Legends. The problem was, he wasn't sure what they were doing with some of it. Finally, it was clear he needed to sit down with the Canadian testing group in person to hash out what they were trying to do. After an interminable afternoon spent being detained at the border by Mounties tearing his car apart looking for contraband, and trying to calculate the value of 5 unopened boxes of magic cards that were not being sold, Elias finally reached Vancouver to try to sort out these problems. At this time, cards were primarily to be determined by design, not development. That is, the group that comes up with the ideas, not the ones who refine it into something balanced and playable. Elias was there primarily to facilitate their vision. The problem was Elias had come into game design through the work on Magic the Gathering. He thought in Magic the Gathering terms. The Canadian testing group were role players, and they approached it with an RPG player's sentiment. Despite being a game, RPGs are not a competition. It's a joint play experience where, if done right, everyone wins by having a good time. Things are debated good-naturedly, in theory, for how allowable it should be, not about fairness like you'd have in a competitive game. For example, the card gaseous form. Elias said, okay, what does it do? Well, it turns them into a gaseous form. Okay, but what does that mean? Well, it means they're not solid. So they can't damage it? Well, not physically, but they can with fire. Oh, so it can be harmed by red spells. Well, obviously not with a lightning bolt. Electricity wouldn't harm them in gaseous form, but fire would. RPG players would recognize the discussion as making perfect sense, while Magic players are raising an eyebrow wondering how to allow fire but not lightning to damage a card. In Magic, red damage is red damage is red damage, regardless of whether it's called lightning fire or hit over the head with a rock. In the end, they were persuaded to accept not dealing or taking damage during combat. However, this RPG background wound up adding something to the game that it was desperately missing. No, I'm not referring to the gold cards. Although Legends was the first, it was already intended that there would be cards made with a mixture of colors. But what Legends gave to the game was character. A Sarah Angel was great to have, but still in the end just a 4/4 flyer that didn't tap to attack. Run as many of them as you want. No, the game needed to have unique beings in it. Lord of the Rings wasn't the epic tale of an army of guys and the orcs they killed. It was about heroes trying to thwart the evil being behind the orcs. So they created summons that were of specific beings, and consequently were unique. You were permitted only one of them. They would have chosen Hero for this actually, but Summon Hero had already been taken, so they went with Legend instead. They drew upon their own characters for this from RPGs. Even Peter Atkinson's wizard Alcor was referenced with his powerful spellbook, except the artist misread Alcor's tome, and so when the art came in, it was of Alcor's tomb, forcing Atkinson to have to pay someone money who had just killed off his D&D character, at least in card form. The introduction of legendary cards to the game gave them a new tool and illustrated something that was missing, and also something that had been feared: the power of IP. Stevens had been quietly trying to secure card rights to delay other companies pushing out a card game tie-in with a popular property that could overshadow Magic. And there were a glut of other games. Many rushed out. And the first true challenger to Magic would indeed be a card adaptation made by the company Decipher and built around Star Wars. For years, Star Wars would be Magic's second place opposite, zigging where Magic zagged, which is probably a significant reason both games could coexist so well. In the end, it would be something unforeseen that would supplant Magic, but in these early days, Magic was building its own heroes from scratch, or rather, legends. Because one of them would go on to be a villain, one of the most terrible villains to plague Dominia. Oh, there's that word again. Not to worry, we'll get to it soon. Legends was a hit, selling out even faster than the previous sets, and would go on to win an award. But there was a significant problem, something no one could possibly have foreseen at Wizards. Arabian Nights and Antiquities had been rather small sets, but Legends was bigger than the original set had been. During production, somehow, it happened that the uncommons were not being properly mixed up. A box of boosters would have all uncommons from one list and no uncommons from the other list. Wizards was forced to set up an exchange program to try to sort the problem out of people getting their hands on the rare and valuable booster boxes, only to walk away with an incomplete set. Legends would also be the center of controversy more than a quarter of a century later. In Magic, it is understood that all references to color are to these schools of magic. However, one Legends card pushed the line too far. Invoke Prejudice, which punished the casting of spells that were the wrong color as far as your creatures were concerned. A green creature instead of a blue creature, for example. The mechanic, in and of itself, isn't surprising. Colors hose each other all the time in Magic. That is, they specifically do something to hinder the game of a different color, like red elemental blast countering or destroying blue stuff. The title, Divorce from Everything Else, is actually not that bad if you think about it in the context of Magic, which has cards titled Torture and Village Cannibals. Acts of evil are also represented on cards in order to represent sorcery that is being used for evil ends. Combining the title and the mechanics, however, made it a bit cringeworthy of a card. Still, it could have ended there had the artist not created an image of clearly Ku Klux Klansmen wielding an axe. The artist has been accused of supporting art involving Nazis and white supremacy, which certainly does not help the case. Taken together, Invoke Prejudice has been Magic's most problematic card for its entire run, and it's no surprise that it has never been reprinted. Two additional items would eventually come together that forced Wizard of the Coast's hand. The first is, and pardon me for drawing this part out, but I just want to make absolutely clear this was unintentional. If you place all of the cards in order from the very beginning, first by color alphabetically, which means that artifact is first, black is second, blue is third, and so on, and each card in that color is then done by title alphabetically, then the first card is the previously mentioned Ankh of Mishra, the second Basalt Monolith, and so on. By the time you hit the blue cards in Legends, you're in the mid-1400s numerically. Why would you want to number cards this way? Well, you would if you were entering them into a database in an orderly format, such as the one that Magic uses for its public database of all cards called Gatherer. Alphabetical order then shockingly results in Invoke Prejudice, the most racially controversial card in the game, just happens to be the 1,488th card in the game's history. Nobody possibly could have planned that. It was made by different people over different sets over the course of a year, yet somehow that number associated with white supremacy happened to be on a card with Ku Klux Klansmen on it. What did not help was the fact that there was an Indian-themed set several years ago and had a seeming coincidence of a card having 7 power, and 11 toughness. In other words, the bottom corner has 7-Eleven printed on it, on a set, again, with an Indian theme. Originally dismissed as a coincidence, until it was revealed that actually it had been intended as a joke about the convenience store 7-Eleven. For context, the documentary The Problem with Apu came out later that year. So once you've shown you'll do something insensitive deliberately, it's hard to be convincing that it was an accident, even when it was an accident. The rather embarrassing situation with Invoke Prejudice finally became untenable in the wake of the 2020 death of George Floyd. And in the weeks that followed, Wizards of the Coast announced that they were going to both ban the card and strike its image from their website. To also try to head off any further problems, Wizards also pulled 6 other early cards, 3 total for Legends alone. For reasons of art, Imprisoned shows a character with dark skin locked in a humiliating situation. An unfortunate title effect juxtaposition, Cleanse, which destroys all black creatures, meaning, of course, creatures in the black school of magic, but can, of course, be misconstrued based upon the title. Cultural stereotypes. Pratish gypsies had an ability that implied they were stealing something from a creature. And culturally specific meanings. Stone-throwing devils, which is apparently a slur against Palestinians, although unrelated to the card's depiction or mechanics, likely drawn from the first story told in Arabian Nights, which involved a merchant throwing stones and accidentally killing the son of a demon. Demon depends upon the translation. Jihad was also banned, although for less clear reasons, possibly because of an Invoke Prejudice-style color-hosing mechanic combined with a reference associated with Islam. Crusade is the final one, presumably for the early depiction of Christian knights, since the mechanic isn't uncommon, and the use of the word crusade or crusader is quite common on Magic cards. So it's not the word or what the card does, it must be the alpha image, although that hasn't spared the altered art reprints from the same banning. What is most notable about that is 3 of those cards, almost half of them, are white cards. I say that it's notable because in the early days, the way the color pie of Magic was interpreted was that white magic was good and black magic was evil. One was the color of helping, the other of harming. The first set, though, to challenge this notion was the set immediately after Legends that continued on the story from Antiquities. It was called The Dark, and it was the brainchild of Jesper Myrfors, an artist and Magic's art director. An immigrant from Sweden, Myrfors didn't make game art because it was a job. Being a fantasy artist was his dream. He loved gaming and he loved fantasy art. When told by those at his college that if he wanted to pursue that he should go to LA or New York and make album covers or dust jackets, he instead approached Wizards because they had purchased the right to a game that he loved, Talislanta, hoping to make some art for it. Lisa Stevens pointed him to White Wolf, who gave him his first sale, but he really wanted to work on Talislanta, and after doing a piece on spec, was taken aboard. He quickly became known to others in the company because of his enthusiasm, and it was he that was instrumental in helping give early Magic its look. Atkinson wanted to showcase fantasy art on the cards, but he couldn't afford it. They were going to make limited with just whatever second or third hand art that they could afford from starving artists and just try to make it match the card. Myrfors was emphatic that Atkinson was making a mistake. Something like this needed to have custom artwork, not whatever you could sort of justify. Atkinson agreed, but he didn't have the budget to hire established artists to make over 300 pieces of art. Myrfors, though, was just as known in the upcoming Seattle art scene as he was to the gamers making Magic, and told him, "Peter, I can get you the artists." Myrfors approached several in the area, many members of the class of '93 at Corinth, where he was attending, and his enthusiasm was infectious. The group put together the 300-plus pictures according to Myrfors' conditions. They could do whatever they wanted, but no stereotypical stuff like the scantily clad damsel. They wanted the game to be inviting to female players as well as to males. and the artwork needed to be something that would make people take notice even from several feet away, so that it would catch the attention of passers-by on this brand new and unique product. Mirfors himself designed all the card frames, intentionally giving each color a different texture to it as well for the benefit of the colorblind. He also designed the card back, the leather book cover that, thanks to the blowback around Arabian Nights' near miss, remains to this day. The art was a massive hit, with probably the crown jewel being the aforementioned Chaos Orb, which served as one of the most iconic images in the history of the game. So when Mirfors pitched the idea of the Dark, Atkinson gave it his stamp of approval, backing Mirfors up with the East Coast playtesters to help turn his ideas into cards. Still, it was a questionable decision, and is possibly what Garfield was referring to when he lamented that design was being handed over to those whose role wasn't in card design. Garfield and Elias would begin putting together a strong design and development department for this reason, rather than have the game controlled by the Wizards R&D department, headed by Glenn Elliott, who worked on the Dark as well, and who greenlit Homelands. The storyline for the Dark was to continue with the aftermath of the Brothers' War, the Silex blast having blotted out the sun, hence the Dark. Mirfor's set was to explore the people's revolt and persecution of magical beings and magical users, including, to emphasize the earlier point, Tividar's crusade. This card is actually a good demonstration of what Mirfors was going for by challenging the conception of white as good. He wanted to show white that was still white, but the fanaticism of white, with crazed mobs, burnings at the stake, and brainwashing religious figures. This, in a way, was actually forward-thinking. In the modern interpretation, white isn't good, it merely emphasizes morality. But what is moral is open to interpretation sometimes, which is why we would sometimes get white villains, such as in Kamigawa, a feudal Japanese set, to emphasize that there is no relation in-game between the term used by race in our world and the coincidental colors for the schools of magic. The white villain was ethnically Japanese. So Mirfor's idea wasn't wrong, merely the execution of it in terms of the color pie, for entirely different reasons, related to top-down card design. See, there are two ways to design cards, top-down and bottom-up. Top-down is an attempt to turn some person, thing, event, or so on into a card. For instance, you conceive of a vampire king, so you think of how the game mechanics might represent that, possibly empowering other vampires through their leadership, or perhaps making bat tokens, or the ability to turn one of your creatures into a vampire. Bottom-up is starting with a mechanic and then making a card around that. For instance, you're making a set which allows use of the graveyard. So to provide some counterplay to that, you need a mechanic that allows one player to remove cards in another player's graveyard from the game. There are numerous ways to do that, like a sort of nuclear option. Just get rid of the entire graveyard. In fact, the Dark would introduce a card that did exactly that. But if they're not doing graveyard tricks, the ability is pointless, isn't it? So you look for what can make it more generally useful. You could have something positive happen when it's done. Perhaps you could make a green carrion eater that gets stronger, put counters on it, by eating corpses, taking creatures out of the graveyard. Perhaps you could make a red shaman that gains power, mana, from burning a body. Same idea as the green creature eating. It has the same service, but does something different. But maybe your set has some interactions between vampires, and you need a way to give them more vampires without making too many specific vampire cards. And you realize you can raise a corpse as a vampire. So you decide to address your remove creatures from the graveyard and your need for vampire creatures by making a card that effectively turns one into the other. Remove a creature from the graveyard and put a vampire creature token on the battlefield. And so, to give this card a name, you call it Vampire King. Two different ways to make a Vampire King reach from entirely different approaches to card design. I mention this now because the dark would have problems with top-down design. Top-down in particular would be an issue of the color pie, the idea that certain things fall within the sphere of what a school of magic can do. Red can't destroy enchantments. Green can't counter spells. White can't deal direct damage to a player. Blue can't perform mass destruction. Black can't destroy artifacts. Many early cards, however, didn't do that because of top-down design, hence why green had a conditional counterspell. Because of the conception of the dark, a lot of design was top-down and disregarded the color pie, like Fire and Brimstone, which is white direct damage. Other top-down designs like Frankenstein's monster fit, but were complicated. One of the most infamous problems would be the card Whippoorwill. Now, fans of Lovecraft might recall that in the Dunwich Horror, whippoorwills were psychopomps, carrying away the souls of the dead. So to represent that, the card had the ability to interfere in things that prevented death, regeneration, damage prevention, and even remove the creature from the game if it died. All very top-down. However, it was placed in the wrong color. Regeneration was primary in green, and damage prevention is green's ally color, white. And perhaps most notable, the focus was so upon the psychopomp ability that the designer forgot something important about whippoorwills. They can fly. The artist didn't forget. Hence, the dark gave us a creature who logically should be able to fly, is drawn flying, but can't actually fly in the game. But while there were some issues related to top-down design and the color pie, one thing that Mirrorforce brought was consistency in the art. Clearly established guidelines for the artist to give it the same atmosphere. The dark truly lives up to the promise of its name, with a moody tone across its set, and is frankly beautiful. The dark wasn't impactful for the power of its cards or of its story, but it will leave an impression because of its flavor. It would also forever change the color red in Magic. The other four colors had a race that was representative of them. Elves for green, merfolk for blue, the undead for black, and white, well, not technically having a race at the time, but humans were found among white. Thanks to the dark, it would firmly be determined that red would be goblins. There were 6 goblin creatures in the dark, 7 if you counted Goblin Rock's sled, which was later eroded to be a goblin. Before that, there had been 4, including Goblin King. Now, typically in fantasy works, you expect humans, elves, and dwarves. But by the time of the Dark, there had only been 3 dwarves. And while 3 more would appear in the following set, dwarves have taken a back seat to goblins, thanks in part because of the Dark. See, everyone associates dwarves with mountains. Making dwarves red is thus completely logical, very top-down. The problem is, the red school of magic just doesn't fit with dwarves. Red is a color of chaos. That describes goblins, not dwarves. Red is a color of breaking artifacts. That also describes goblins. Dwarves craft fine artifacts, not break them. Red is a color of anarchy. That's also goblins, not dwarves. There's also the fact that since goblins are usually considered bad guys and non-humans, their misfortunes leave them open to physical comedy possibilities, allowing cards to lighten the mood if it's needed. Following in the footsteps of the Dark was Homelands. I'm sure that also sounds like a mistake to Magic aficionados who know that Homelands was not the next set to come out. It wasn't even close. Yet if you look at the set, it is quite clear that Homelands very much has this year 1 period of, well, randomness to it. Well, there's a good reason for that. It's because Homelands was going to be the next set after the Dark. It was a last vestigial holdover from a different era by the time it finally hit store shelves. See, the Warm Bodies approach for hiring brought in gamers from the Seattle area to fill whatever roles were needed. People were happy just to be working at a game company, no matter what they were actually doing, and hopeful that they could work their way out of their current positions and into the true work of gaming. In any other company, it would be the height of absurdity for 2 members of the customer service team to be working on making the latest version of the company's flagship product. For Wizards of the Coast in 1994, that was just another day at the office. Atkinson's early flirtations with a flat hierarchy approach had left the door open for people with no design experience to do design work. You can see now why Garfield and Elias were trying to develop a corporately strong design and development department to take control of the game's creation away from those who were inexperienced and put it in the hands of those who had spent years making and refining the game, who understood how everything worked. It wasn't that those outside might not have good ideas. Legends certainly had proven that. But good ideas alone do not a good set make. Scott Hungerford and Kyle Namvar were inspired by antiquities and the background information offered, fascinated with the article published that explained the world of Dominia. Okay, enough teasing. Let me explain that for the confused and for the grinding teeth alike. Veterans might be familiar with the fact that what is now referred to solely as the multiverse was once referred to as Dominia, which is distinct from the world of Dominaria, where much of the history of the game occurred. But in the first year, Dominia was treated as being the world of magic. You can see this in the flavor text of cards from the limited, unlimited printings, as well as in antiquities. In fact, the use of Dominia as the world would remain through the 4th edition in the flavor text of the card Grizzly Bear, only to be quietly changed to Dominaria in the 5th edition. Dominaria wouldn't be mentioned in any other flavor text until Stronghold in 1998. But the change occurred much sooner than that. Issue number 3 of The Duelist, publishing date of fall 1994, referred to the next set that was actually published, Fallen Empires, as occurring on Dominaria Prime. The use of Dominia eventually stopped, presumably to avoid confusing the multiverse with the world. But back to our 2 customer service team members. They thought Magic needed to have 2 things: compelling lore and subtlety. Who was Sarah from Sarah Angel? Who was Senger from Senger Vampire? The set would present that, as well as advance the notion that it was not goblins, but minotaurs that were the true red-defining creature. Herloon Minotaur was another iconic card from Magic thanks to its art. The card itself is so weak as to be unplayable. Glenn Elliott and Steve Bishop, both of whom worked with Mirrorforce on designing the Dark, liked it and greenlit it originally for release after the Dark. However, it was soon apparent that Homelands was in actuality much worse off than anyone had thought. There was no way it was ready to be released. Rather than canceling it outright, though, the decision was made to extend its production period, pushing it back to after Ice Age was eventually released. Which, yes, was finally specifically planned. After these other sets got out the door, of course. But Wizards was aware of what was rapidly becoming a problem and would have to be addressed with the next several sets that would go out. The age of expansion was, well, leading to a period when expansion was going to be a problem.